Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of Upship, the Airship History Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Rogers, and it's great to be in the offices of Straightline Aviation, a leading British airship company in the beautiful county of Shropshire. I'm here with Mark Dorey, the CEO, Mike Kendrick, the founder and chairman, and Jim Dexter, the director of operations. And we'll be having a discussion about this team's really in-depth history with airships and about Straightline Aviation and the business and what their objectives are. So thank you very much, guys, for having us here in your offices. Great to be
It's
here.
a pleasure to welcome you, Nick.
Good to be.
Thank you. So I think we'll go around and just talk to each of you about your experience, because you all have this deep connection with airships. Now, Mark, you and I have a connection because, as regular listeners will know, I first got interested in airships when I saw the Mazda airship fly over my school back in the 90s. That was the Virgin Balloon and Airship Group. And Mark, you were chief operating officer of that company. In fact, everyone here, I think, has some kind of connection with that company.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting. It's always interesting to hear people who have seen airships and the advertising airships back in the 90s and 2000s. And I was lucky enough to join Mike, who founded the company back in 93, and joined Jim, who was running the operations at the time. So we've been together for a very long time.
Yes, and so Mike, you are in fact a living legend of aviation, alongside Buzz Aldrin, Harrison Ford, and Tom Cruise.
I don't know how that happened, Nick. I really don't, but I am here.
Quite the accolade. You also have an honorary doctorate from the University of Wolverhampton in recognition of your lighter-than-air expertise. And you've been involved in airships and lighter-than-air generally for many decades. I'd say most of your professional career. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you started off in advertising hot air balloons before even a market for that existed.
Yes, I was a young PR executive and driving to a meeting for a company called Belstaff. It was one of my clients, and there was a balloon flying over the motorway and causing traffic jams, and it was called Thursday's Child. And I know that was the case because I actually bought the balloon some months later. But at the meeting, the MD of Belstaff said, "What can you do for us at the Isle of Man race, motorbike race?" And I said, "Well, why don't we put your name on one of these newfangled hot air balloon things?" And he said, "Is it possible?" And I said, "I don't know, but I'll find out." So I contacted the other balloon, and I went for a flight in my business suit, and realised how poorly dressed I was for it.
Was that your first balloon flight?
Pardon?
Was that your first ever balloon flight?
Yeah, first balloon flight. And in those days, the technology was so much different to the balloons now. It had one burner of 1.5 million BTUs. Nowadays, they are 11 or 12 million BTUs. And it didn't have what they call a parachute rib at the top, which is called a parachute because it's shaped like a parachute, and it sits below a hole, which is smaller in size than this parachute rib, and it fixed just by internal pressure. With the early balloons, with their single burner, you had to, when you came into land, crack the top off a bit like an egg. They were held in either with Dutch lacing or Velcro. So once they were open, you were going down, you couldn't stop it. With a parachute, parachute rip, you could actually come down, make an approach, let it back up. And so it's huge. It was hugely different. And the early days, they used to say, any landing was a good landing, which you walked away from, and that was true.
So you were sort of dipping your toe into hot air balloons, but I think you came to the realization that actually advertising on a hot air balloon was not legal.
No, I didn't know that. Of course, I was a very young man in PR, and I couldn't see how anybody could stop us. So, but they did. And one of my other clients was a local zoo, and I wanted to put Dudley Zoo on it. I wanted somebody to pay for the balloon I just bought, actually, and so that's why I got into that. And I was told I couldn't do it because it was a Board of Trade regulation, and I argued that if British Airways could put their name on an aircraft, why couldn't I? Well, they're not the charterer or hirer by demise. That was the words. So in the end, I found a way round it by forming companies that had an advertising tagline. In other words, that's the wonder of Woolworths Limited. And,
so you could put that on
you can put
because it's the name of the company.
Yeah, and Dudley Zoo visit the Chimps Tea Party at 3:00 every afternoon, Limited. And Milk's Got a Lot of Bottle, Limited, for the things like that. Nivea, Out of the Blue, Limited. And it wasn't until I was going to do some work for Everest Double Glazing, and they wanted a panel that said Everest Double Glazing, ring 0214556789 for a free brochure. No representative will call, Limited. And the Board of Trade said, we give up. And that's how...
so you basically wore them down.
Yeah. And it was... other people were trying it as well. So I'm not claiming to do anything that was so revolutionary, but I was forced to do it out of desperation, really, because I just bought this balloon, which was very expensive.
And you had to pay it
young
off.
Advertising, PR, executive salary and all that. So, and it became very successful. So we formed a company called Lighter Than Air Limited. And that operated for some pretty big clients, and building societies and Robinson's Barley Water, all those kind of things.
And how did you make the move from balloons into airships?
I'd always call my company Lighter Than Air Limited, and the logo was actually an airship flying through a balloon. So I always got my eye on that. And then Richard got into ballooning, Richard Branson, with a competitor of ours, and learned to fly. And he was deciding to fly the Atlantic. And so he phoned me up and he said, can you help me? I said, of course I will. So we got together and that flight preparation was well underway. And I really didn't get involved in any of the planning of that. I got involved in the end of it. So we always wanted to fly. I always wanted to get into airships because with balloons, it was a question of flying over the right camera, if you like, or the right populated area. We did some fantastic things. We got what they call rotation vents in balloons by then, which meant if you pulled one, it spun round. So if we knew where a camera was in another balloon, we could actually spin it so that the Woolworths logo was on camera. Because there's nothing worse than the client being on the television seeing Worths. So we spent a lot of time training pilots in that kind of environment. Like and if they did TV interviews afterwards, they knew which side of the camera to speak to because their logo on the uniform was on the left and they didn't want to be standing right where it would be seen.
Yes.
And things. So we did proper media training. It became very successful, which is why Richard called me. And we were involved with a guy called Pearl Instrand. He used to build balloons for us, as well as Cameron balloons. He was very keen on airships, and he designed this airship called the GA-42, which was a single-engine airship, and we bought the first one. He'd also, on that journey, he also built a thermal airship, and we bought the first one of those as well, which was a total disaster, and we crashed it into the first flight.
Whoops.
Didn't work. And There was a PR nightmare because it crashed into a housing estate on a field in a housing estate. And there's this wonderful picture of this tail of an airship sticking out the top of the houses, and the headline was "Warning: Airships can damage your health."
Not what you want to see,
Yeah.
is it?
So, but we were pioneers in a lot of ways, so we took chances.
Well, so you mentioned your association with Richard Branson, and that seems to have been a theme throughout a lot of your aviation career. What was it like working with him, especially on some of his? Because you worked with him on his pioneering balloon record-setting flights. What was he like to work with in those flights?
Richard's. How can I explain it? He's very different, but he's a kindly man. But he does like his own way. And I got on very well with him because I like my own way as well. We got on mostly. We had some blinding rows, as you can imagine, and standing up to each other nose to nose. And I won't use the language here, but we shake hands and have a good laugh afterwards. And so you have to understand people like that. Richard's very, very driven, almost to the exclusion of his own safety. And so, you can't just stand up and shout at him. He doesn't react to that. But there's better ways of handling it.
I see. And one of the projects that you worked with him on, which caught my eye, was Vintage Airways, which was DC-3 flights in Florida. How did that come about?
Well, we were operating in America at that time with airships and balloons, and someone came up on the staff came up with this idea of using the old DC-3s to fly passengers. Well, it was an amazing idea. And it was a lovely product, and it involves two DC-3s flying from Orlando to Key West. And it was themed. Every day was... I spent a lot of money on these aircraft with putting sound systems in and all Art Deco. They were absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. And every day was the 8th of May 1945, which was Victory in Europe Day. And so we bought 30,000 copies of the New York Post, original ones, and we themed all the air hostesses and the pilots and everything in. And one of the problems was that it was the pilot had to go to the back of the aircraft after they're all seated in this beautifully upholstered aircraft and physically lock people in. I thought that looked very bad. So I came up with the idea of getting a dog called Skippy. And Skippy we had him trained, and we picked him up 3 days before the inaugural flight, actually. And he was trained to run on the aircraft just before takeoff and scratch the cockpit door. And of course, Catherine, they were all called Catherine, the air hostesses, said, "Oh, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but this Skippy, you met her in the lounge, but she's not allowed to come on the flight, and she won't do anything anybody says. It has to be the captain. So I'll just have to get him." So the captain had come out, "Oh, you naughty boy," and take him out and throw him out the door and lock it. And that was, therefore, there was that process.
A little bit of theatre.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was all a bit of theatre because we used to, on the taxiing, we used to get her to read the news from the New York Post. And there was one copy in all the seats. And she'd talk about Lauren Bacall and just getting married. The latest rage in New York was chewing gum and would it catch on and all that kind of stuff. And she said, but the really big news is that it looks as like the war's going to end in Europe quite soon, and everybody clapped. And she said, it was great for me because my husband's flying out there, and in great danger. And we used to take off to the Andrew Sisters Wing and a Prayer. And when we got to the top of the ascent, the captain would come on, pre-recorded piece, and say, "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely weather ahead, but I'm just getting some interesting news from the White House. I'll tell you what, I'll just plug you in to the White House." And then they announced the war was over. And Catherine ran up from the back shouting, "Wonderful, wonderful," and went into the galley. And the captain said, "Well, that's great news, and great news for her husband. So let's bring all the boys home with some great music." And Chattanooga Cuckoo came on, and the Glenn Miller songs and all that kind of stuff. And she came out and said, "It's a champagne flight today." And the reason that was important is because all these beautiful seats that we had, they're going to get marked and sticky with all sugary drinks and coffee and all that kind of stuff. So we made it all a champagne flight. And then when we got to Key West, Harry Belafonte would sing "Island in the Sun" as we went round. And when we were taxiing, we had the weather forecast. It was always the same, 95 degrees. And Ella Fitzgerald was singing "It's Too Darn Hot." So it was a lovely, lovely product. And we only lost a couple of million.
That's the way with aviation, isn't it?
Yeah. They say, if you want to make a small fortune in aviation, start with a large one.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah. Well, so we'll come to Straightline in a bit. But yeah, thank you for sharing some of your fascinating experience. And maybe Jim, if we move to you. So Jim Dexter, you're the Director of Operations here at Straightline, and you must be one of the most experienced airship pilots in the world. On the website it says you have over 12,000 flying hours and over 500 hours on test flights. You've flown for Goodyear, American Blimp Corporation, Lightship Group, Airship Ventures. You've got a very strong background in
I've
aviation.
been around for a while.
Yeah, and I just wonder what drew you to become a pilot in the first place? Never mind an airship pilot, but what drew you to flying in the first place?
I'd always been interested in flying. I don't remember too much about it. My friends tell me I was, and I think it always fascinated me. I do remember one Christmas when we were living in Okinawa, I got a present. It was a B-17 model, and that just captivated me, and it stuck with me. And so later years, when I graduated high school, joined the Army, became a parachute rigger. And that activity of jumping out of airplanes and helicopters, it just further spawned my interest in flying. And I got out of the Army, went to Embry-Riddle, and got my commercial instrument multi-engine ratings, and that started my career in aviation.
And what were you doing for Embry-Riddle?
I was going to taking a degree for Bachelor of Science in Aeronautics.
Right. Okay.
And
then one day you saw the Goodyear blimp, I think.
I was very motivated at school. I didn't want to take any breaks, but by my senior year, I decided I needed one, and I arranged to get a job in southern Florida at Pompano Air Center, and it just so happened to be that that was the airport that Goodyear was relocating to from Miami. So I was working at the FBO, and the Goodyear blimp flew in and landed on its arrival to Pompano. And I was the one who got to the fuel truck first before everybody else to run down and refuel it when they called in, and got a tour of the ship and got inspired by that and decided to give the chief pilot my resume, all half page of it, in my enthusiasm. And fortunately, 2 weeks later, he offered me a job on the ground crew that I wasn't experienced enough to get a pilot's position.
And what would you have been doing on the ground crew for Goodyear? What did that
I was called what they called a field wage. I wasn't a permanent hire. I was a temporary hire, but working full time, and went with them on their tour. They'd go on a 6-month tour of the country every year. And as a ground crew, I was doing basic duties of pressure watch and putting the mast up, taking it down, taking care of equipment and that type of thing. assisting the launch and recovery of the ship, and everything that you would do in support of that. So, one of the advantages that I had, because I did have my pilot's licenses, the other pilots on the operation, they would talk to the crew chief and get him to allow me to go on a flight with him on a cross country. And basically the pilots would take off, they'd sit me in the seat, and I'd fly to the destination, would swap seats, and they'd land. So I was able to accrue a lot of flight time in the Goodyear blimp. And that leveraged me into a position to the point the chief pilot of Goodyear, Frank Hogan, called me up and offered me an opportunity to go to Houston, Texas, where they had the America, another Goodyear blimp. And I went out there and interviewed for a pilot position. And a few weeks after that, I was offered the position to fly for Goodyear.
So you're a Goodyear blimp pilot. That's pretty
how
cool.
I started my career. It was pretty amazing at the time. I felt very fortunate. Yeah.
So I think a lot of listeners to this podcast are interested in airships, but very few people have actually flown in one. So what's the sensation like of flying in an airship, like the Goodyear blimp that you would have flown back then?
Well, first, a lot of the similarities are that piloting an airship from an aeronautical point of view is no different than any other fixed-wing aircraft, heavier than air. All the instrumentation is there, and you're working within the airspace, and you have to abide by the regulations and the radio phraseology, and getting in and out of an airport, navigating and moving about is all the same. The difference is that you're flying an aircraft that's got a huge envelope, big sail area, and it's greatly affected by outside influence like the winds and whatnot. And in particular, when you're taking off and landing, or for the most part landing, when you're slowing down, that really becomes noticeable, because you have your mindset and your mind's eye on where you're going to land, and you do your best to get to that point. But on the way, the winds are going to try to blow you off course and move you around. So it's adapting to that. And the other big difference is the pressure system, and managing the pressure system, which obviously an airplane is not going to have. Mm-hmm. And that is critical. And understanding pressure system management is very important. Understanding how to trim an airship up to execute a landing is very important. So there are certain areas that you have to develop a lot of skill and knowledge to be able to fly an airship capably.
So it sounds like there's a whole extra layer of stuff that you have to think about that a fixed-wing pilot wouldn't have to consider so much.
One of the things that's notable when you're teaching a fixed-wing pilot how to fly an airship is on takeoff, you'll roll off and you'll get off the ground, you'll nose it up 30 degrees, and you're at full power, and then you chop the power. Just after you start your rate of climb, you chop the power. The fixed-wing pilot's going to jump out of his seat. And in an airship, you just keep going up.
Yeah. He's going to think we're going to stall.
Exactly.
We're going to come crashing back down.
Yeah.
So you've piloted a great many different airships. The GZ-20, which is, I think we've been talking about, the Skyship 600, pretty much every kind of light ship, the Zeppelin NT. Did you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite airship that you really enjoyed flying?
I don't know that I do. I have airships that I would prefer to fly.
Mm-hmm.
There are airships that I would prefer not to fly. Some of the more enjoyable one was the A-50, the very first light ship. When I joined them, it was experimental, and it was 50,000 cubic feet, and one of the smallest ships that I'd flown. And it was a little sports car. It was like driving a Porsche. You could turn it on a dime. It would accelerate quickly. You could scream up and down, had a very good pressure system. So that was a lot of fun to fly. There was another airship I flew by a guy named, it was designed by a guy named Steve Garner, and he had a company called Memphis Airships. And the ship that he built was inspired by a comedian named Gallagher, and he did this pedal-powered airship. It was one of his gimmicks. So a Japanese company got interested in advertising with it, and so they contacted Steve, and he built them a pedal-powered airship. But it was made to look like it was pedal-powered because it had pedals that really didn't do anything, and it had an engine on the back. The pressure system was powered by an actual hair dryer, and it was, I think it was like 6,000 or 7,000 cubic feet. It was very, very, very small. And there's a long story behind that, but that was a lot of fun to fly.
But it wasn't actually pedal powered, so you
no, it wasn't.
weren't
No.
sitting there like on a bicycle.
I was put in an outfit, white shorts, white shirt, and I was to fly out over a reservoir. And my family was supposed to be down in a boat, and we were on vacation, and I'd fly over them for some reason, and that's what I did. It's a long story. I mean, it didn't end too well, but it was a fun airship to fly. Because you're sitting literally in a lawn chair and with cables, and there was nothing around you, and it really felt like you're
Gosh, sounds like sort of Alberto Santos Dumont style pioneering.
Very similar,
because he was sitting on a bicycle type structure for one of his airships, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. You've, in your 12,000 hours that you've flown, you must have had some sort of slightly hairy moments. I wonder if there's anything particular that springs to mind. I learned about flying from that type things.
Always. I'm any pilot who's been out and flying for a career is going to have had situations that he's had to get himself out of, got himself into them, and he has to get himself out of them. And I've got a few.
Let me interrupt and remind you of the one that you found terrifying. And the ground crew, is in America, and the ground crew actually called me here and said, Jim's in all kind of trouble. And told me the circumstances. So I called him on the phone. You remember that flight? You'll never forget that.
Was this a light ship you were in?
Yeah. We were in Texas. We're flying. Actually departed. I believe it was Tucson, and we were on our way east. We had a good tailwind, which was unusual for that day, and we were on our way to El Paso. We're actually on our way to Deming, but we decided to go on to El Paso, and there was a thunderstorm that was building in the south, across the border in Mexico, 90 miles, whatever, to the south. And it started developing, and we landed in Lordsburg, and I went to the flight service station there and got an update from them on what that activity was. And it was tracking easterly, no influence to expect it to move and alter its course. And as I was approaching El Paso, it had, and it moved up and cut right through El Paso. So I had to hold off well to the west of El Paso. And the storm, there's a mountain range that terminates in El Paso. And I believe some type of influence from that caused the storm to back up and over top of me. And it was a Category 5. It was a huge storm. The city of El Paso called it the storm of the year. That was, I think, not too long after Desert Storm, when everything was the storm of the whatever. Yeah. And it was just a matter of getting myself out of that. It was probably the most unsettling flight I'd ever had in an airship. Where you know, in any aircraft or anything you do where you're in control, you're fine. But when you're in a situation where you have absolutely no control, regardless of what you do, all the norms that you've got, you're using power and controls, nothing's working. It was kind of like that.
That sounds unsettling. And as you say, as a pilot, you're trying to fly the aircraft, aren't you?
Yeah, I'll tell you. When I worked for Goodyear, there were two pilots, and they had an incident, and I'd learned from them. I won't say their names, but it's two pilots, and they got caught in a thunderstorm in New York, and it took them up to 18,000 feet. And now the ceiling on a Goodyear blimp is 10,000, and you usually operate with a pressure height of about 3,000 feet, 2,500 feet or lower. and they got sucked up to 18,000 feet. And they were in it for a very long time, and they didn't land to their own ground crew. They got blown so far off course, like over 100 miles, and there just happened to be one of the other Goodyear blimp crews in an airship operating in that area, and they landed to them on a highway. Afterwards, they both took sabbaticals. Goodyear put them in a tire factory for a year because they didn't want to fly anymore. And they told me, one of them was my instructor pilot, said that if you ever get in a thunderstorm, get as low as you can, build your pressure, and stay as low as you can. So that's what I did. And I got out of it. When I fought it it seemed like forever, but it was probably 45 minutes fighting. And I remember turning, and it started to subside. The rain stopped, and it was slowing down. The winds, I could finally make some headway, because at one point I was getting blown back, like 10 miles an hour backwards, and I had to keep looking behind me to see where we were headed, because I had to stay into the wind. It's just the winds were so strong. I was at full power and going back. If I just let the nose drift a little bit, it would throw me back quite a bit. And I felt like I was getting sucked back into the storm when that was happening. But at one point it started to subside, and I looked out to the northwest, and I saw a light, because it was pitch black. This was like 4 p.m, and I finally saw a bit of light, and so I kind of aimed for that, and we finally made our way out. One of the funny things is it's the first time I actually declared an emergency, because I was listening to El Paso approach control, and I was listening to them handle airplanes that were supposed to be landing at El Paso International, and they were diverting. And one pilot said that I'll advise company traffic do not attempt to approach the airport, and they were shutting it down. My ground crew was there on the field, putting up a mast, waiting for me. I couldn't talk to them because of the mountain range between us. And so I declared the emergency and asked them to talk to my ground crew to tell them to come back, because I was not going to be landing at El Paso. I was going to let go to another airport. I didn't know where at that point, but I told them I need them on this side of the mountain, which they did. And I ended up going back to Deming, about 90 miles back west, and the ground crew had a police escort to the field, and we had a crewman. He got a bit excited because, the ship was in danger. He was a good friend. And when he got to the field in Deming, he took the truck right through the fence gate, didn't even stop to get it out there. He was that excited about it. But at one point in the flight, I could look out onto a road that was half a mile away. It was very dark. And there must have been 50 emergency service vehicles with their lights going all the way down the road. And there's lightning, and I could see that. And I looked down, and there were people in the field up to their knees in mud, because it was just a torrential downpour trying to bring me down. So I'd wave to them, I'm fine, I'm okay. Because there's no way I could have, even approached them with an airship. But that was... I probably went on a bit too long, but that was a very harrowing flight in an airship.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's fascinating to hear the practical realities of what it is to actually, the considerations you have to have when you're flying an airship. Now, I'm sure, even despite that story, there'll be lots of people listening who are kind of keen on the idea of becoming an airship pilot. What would your advice be to anyone listening who might be interested in becoming an airship pilot?
A couple things. I think that there's a future for the industry, mainly in what we're doing. I think there'll be opportunity for anyone interested in getting in either flying or working on the ground crew or being a mechanic on airships. But unfortunately, there aren't any companies that are offering flight training at this time. We plan to change that. But right now, you can't go out and buy a license, buy the training. So the only way to really get your airship license now is to get hired by a company that's operating an airship. And on that basis, the qualifications to be considered are that you have to have a heavier than air category commercial license with multi-engine instrument, ideally instructor ratings, whether it be fixed wing or rotor wing, and I would say 750 minimum PIC hours, and ideally a 1,500 to be considered for the job. And then that way you can get in, you get some experience under your belt, get the license, and you would certainly be an attractive candidate for us.
So basically, get flying, get some hours under your belt, get your ratings, and then approach the companies that are operating airships. Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing your experience, Jim. We'll circle back to Mark, where we started. I mean, Mark, you've been involved in Virgin Airship and Balloon Company for a long time, but also one of the projects that you worked on with Mike was Mineseeker. And that was, we had a number of patrons, including Nelson Mandela, I think Brad Pitt. There's a picture of Brad Pitt on the wall here. What was the genesis of that particular project?
Well, actually, Mike's probably better on the Genesis side of it. I think, Mike, it was conversation that you had.
It was Princess Diane that got me onto that, of course, but because she was heavily involved in landmine problems. And so we talked to the British government, who basically had some ground-penetrating radar technology, which I think you, Mark, negotiated that deal with them, didn't you?
Yeah, it was the first public-private partnership with DERA, as it was then, soon to become Kinetic. So they gave us permission to use their ground-penetrating radar on any airborne platform. And the airship was the most suited to that because it was relatively slow flying, vibration-free. And at that time, the aerial for the radar was probably 20 feet across, and very sensitive. So the airship was the perfect platform. And we ran trials here in the UK, identifying landmines that were buried and it went very successfully. And then took the ship down to Kosovo and repeated the trials there again extremely successfully.
Yeah, so there's a film called Mineseekers, produced by Martin Gregory. It's a very interesting piece of film because when you are testing stuff like this, we had to fly the airship down to Kosovo via Italy. That was a picture on there with Richard Branson and that airship. With the Mineseeker and under the UN flag. And that was the only place in the world where I could find a minefield that had been planted to train operatives to dig them up. Mm-hmm. So they knew where every single mine was in this minefield. So we went out there to, run the equipment over that minefield, and we found every single one. Not 99.9, but every single one. So it was a huge success. And then I actually got on an aeroplane and went to see Nelson Mandela, who became a patron of Mineseeker. And then we always knew that an airship was a good thing to use because of the lack of vibration, which affected things. But we developed it further so that it could be deployed on a helicopter. So we then went to Croatia and deployed it there and tested it all out there. It was a great success.
It was, absolutely, and it was just a shame of it was the difficulty we had in persuading the mine clearing industry to adopt the technology and the methodology associated with using the radar system to not identify so much where the mines were, but to identify where they weren't. Around
safe areas, is that?
Yeah, exactly. So around 80-90% of land which is designated as mined actually has no landmines in it at all.
No.
So the methodology was to release that land quickly back into productive use, whereas traditional mine clearance is about starting in one corner and working your way across, and it keeps a lot of people busy for a lot of time.
But it's a big killer. Big killer.
Yes.
Somebody steps on a mine every 20 seconds, and it blows their leg off or their foot off. And what does the damage is the fragments of the mine plus the fragments of the bone propels up at 400 miles an hour and enters the body around the groin area. And it's the path of that shrapnel, bones and shrapnel, that determines whether they live or die. Either way, it's horrific.
Yes. And it is still a major humanitarian problem even now.
And it at the current rate of clearance, it takes 600 years to get rid of them. But it's a very political arena.
Yes, well, you've got large non-governmental organisations, lots of money, lots of grants. Yeah, that's always going to be political, isn't it? Even though everyone has the same end goal to clear the mines. Interesting. Well, I mean, so we've heard a bit about all your individual experiences, huge amount of experience with airships. What brings you together now is Straightline Aviation. Now, Straightline is not a manufacturer of airships. You'll be an operator. What is the story behind Straightline Aviation? How did it come about, and what are you trying to achieve?
Right. Well, when we exited the airship business, which was after 9/11, all the ships were grounded. And we had, 19 airships. We built about 30 airships altogether. But we had 19 airships and lots of balloons around the world, and 400 people that were all put out of work. So we exited at that stage. And Mark and I went our separate ways. And then we were always aware that there was new technology coming along, and it was actually the hybrid aircraft was actually invented by a guy called Roger Monk, who you probably heard of. And Mark and I decided to get in the car and go and talk to him. And we did, and he flew a thing called the Sky Kitten.
That's right, yeah.
And he flew that. It was a model. 30-foot long model.
This was at Cardington, wasn't it?
Sorry?
He was doing this at Cardington,
that's right,
I think, wasn't he?
Yeah. And he put in a sort of artificial lake, and he showed us how you could land on water and all that kind of stuff. And we knew at that point that technology was going to take over where the airships had left. And so we founded, Mark and I founded Straightline Aviation with the express purpose of getting these aircraft out into the market, and that was 9 years ago.
About that, yeah.
And it's taken us this long.
Well, we'll come on to that, but I suppose you're that's part of the reason for that is you're developing an entire new industry. But you as an operator, not as a designer, you have a choice in the technology that you use, and you've made that choice with an airship, the Z1, which traces origins back to Lockheed Martin, the P791. Why have you chosen that Z1 airship?
I think we see it very much as the most capable design in the market at the moment, and as Mike said earlier this afternoon, we've worked with and looked at most of the other credible airship designs that are currently out there in the market. And there are a number of significant differences between the Lockheed design and a traditional airship which operates, as Jim said, at or near neutral buoyancy. And the hybrid airship, as it's called, and this would include also the HAB design, is designed to operate significantly heavier than air, and it does it by a combination of things, and that is the wider envelope. So most people are familiar with the traditional cigar-shaped envelope of a lighter-than-air airship, whereas the hybrid airships have a bilobe or trilobe design, which creates a big wing, and that provides aerodynamic lift, as well as getting lift from the vector thrust of the engines, and that means it can take off heavier than air and land heavier than air, and that creates a window for cargo and freight to be offloaded and unloaded in a more manageable way. It makes it more stable on the ground. In the case of Lockheed's design, it means you don't have to have a mast, so you don't need the infrastructure. So it means that you can access remote areas of the world that doesn't have any, doesn't have a traditional runway or airport facility. And then particularly when it comes to the Lockheed ship, they have what's called an air cushion landing system underneath, and that's like a hovercraft. So it provides the mechanism to maneuver on the ground, and then when you're in your position, your chosen position to manage the cargo onloading and offloading, it goes into reverse thrust and sucks the airship down to the ground and provides additional stability. And really that answers all the problems that many airships have had historically, and enables for the first time an airship to carry significant load, and the payload of the Z1 is 20 tons or thereabouts. So it means that you can fly a much heavier payload over long distances, as I say, to remote parts of the world that are not serviced by traditional forms of transport. And then you don't need the personnel, you don't need the infrastructure. Jim, I'm looking at you and going to ask you if I've missed anything out of that little synopsis, being the operations man.
Right. Effectively, you've got that right. The key to me is that it overcomes the Achilles heel that the conventional airship has. When you land an airship, a conventional ship, like you land a Goodyear blimp at an airport, you need to maneuver it to a mooring mast. And even if you had a mobile mast, you need to drive the mast up to it. And the ship is vulnerable at that point when it's on the ground. And all airships operate heavier than air. That's how they operate. And the degrees of heaviness is what we're talking about, is the difference. When the Goodyear blimp can take off and land 800 pounds heavy, and we're looking to operate 15,000 pounds heavy. So that's the difference in the lifting body Mark is talking about. The being able to overcome that, the risk factor just opens up your operating capability. And
so what? I mean, this is an airship history podcast, and listeners will have seen pictures of the Zeppelins of old with hundreds of ground crew being physically pulled down to a mooring mast,
Sure.
and then tied up to the cart that sort of runs around in the ring. So that's significant levels of infrastructure. What does it mean operationally, and for the kinds of business that you'll be doing, that you can operate without that level of infrastructure?
Well, it's to a large degree is the heaviness in the air cushion landing system that's going to make the difference. You can keep the ship on the ground fully laden and use the air cushion landing system to maneuver. You don't need a ground crew to pull you off wind and let the wind blow you off in the direction you want to go. You can actually taxi around with the air cushion landing system just like a hovercraft, and that makes the difference. It eliminates the need for that large ground crew infrastructure and equipment that you're referring to.
So the air cushion landing system is the airship's ability to maneuver on the ground.
Absolutely, yeah. And as Mark mentioned, you can go into what we call grip mode, reverse the airflow. That'll keep the airship, sucks the airship to the ground. It won't keep it from being lifted light, upwards, but it keeps it from being pushed sideways. So your ability to stay in position is greatly enhanced when you get a changing wind condition. You have gusty conditions, or the winds are light and variable. It'll sustain the airship on the ground in position in those types of conditions. That's a significant difference.
And the big thing is, because it sits there heavier than air on the ground, significantly heavier than air, it creates a window where you can unload and offload the cargo.
Sure.
If you do it with an airship which is, slightly heavier than air, you take 20 tons off, you've got 20 tons of free lift that you've got to manage.
It wants to go up.
It wants to disappear up in the sky instantaneously. So the difficulty has always been with heavy lift. The idea of putting a big weight on a bag of helium is not a new one. But it's how you deal with that weight transference that's the key. And that's what the hybrid airship designed by Lockheed.
One of my favourite illustrations of that problem is the very first hydrogen balloon flight, 1783 or 4, I think it was. Professor Jack Charles, he and his friend did this flight. They landed. Charles's friend stepped out of the balloon, and it shot up to the height of a mile.
Yeah.
And he got it back down again, and poor Professor Charles never flew again. Understand?
Oh, yes, you're right. You're right. It was 83, I think.
It was shortly after the Montgolfier brothers, I think it was. But yeah, so that load exchange problem has been the hurdle for heavy lift airships to overcome. And we were talking before we started recording about cargo lifter. They weren't able to overcome this. But it does seem that this technology is the solution to that. But what kind of markets would that open up? What kind of places would you be doing business?
I think, that's an interesting question, Nick. The airship should be seen as a tool. It's like a Swiss Army knife of the air, or a truck in the sky, as it's often described. And there are a huge number of markets that it can address with the particular unique characteristics that it's got. The biggest one, if you think about it, is overall is the ability to reach places in a way that is currently now impossible. So large parts of the world are not connected by traditional forms of transport, let alone aviation. And the airship, the hybrid airship, can do everything that a helicopter can do, but it can do it over much greater range. It can do it more safely, cheaper, and in a more environmentally friendly way. So the one of the key markets is freight and cargo, and that's the low-hanging fruit, as we often describe it. But it also has a great role as a facilitator in humanitarian applications, reaching remote communities that are not connected, as I say, by traditional forms of transport, improving on the social and economic well-being of those people, whether it be bringing medical aid or food, or whether it be supplying equipment. There are all sorts of things in the humanitarian sphere, as well as disaster relief, so responding to man-made and
you can see it, can't you? A situation where you've had say a Hurricane Katrina or something, where all the infrastructure is damaged, the airport's out of action, the roads are busted, the ports are busted. Well, you can fly in directly to the point of need without requiring that infrastructure.
And we can land on water. And we can taxi up onto land. We can also act as a forward communications relay station, so acting as an observation platform to coordinate relief efforts on the ground, to restore mobile communications if that's necessary. So there are lots of ways that we can help in disaster relief situations. On top of that, survey and surveillance. One of the people one of the areas we're looking at in a lot of detail at the moment is in Brazil, and looking and helping to manage the threats to deforestation, and improving the situation out in that region. And then you can go all the way through there, border security, border patrol. We as a company don't intend to get into the military applications, but there are undoubtedly military applications for this, which is where the program was, or a number of programs were born. And you can take that through to passenger operations in the future, luxury tourism. So there's a plethora of different markets that the
yes, and it's not Nick just disaster areas, but humanitarian need is vast because in remote parts of the world, people are dying all the time for no reason. Let me give you an example. If you contracted cancer, you would either you just go to the NHS like I did and got fixed. And if you're in America, you would open your insurance and get fixed. We're working with a very large NGO called RadAid, and they can, because we can carry hospital units, if you like, and radiation units, so that they can go and screen them if they've got, to see whether they've got cancer, and if they have, they can radiate them. Because now, if they've got cancer, they just die. They don't get the chance like you and I to go into the NHS and get it fixed.
Get diagnosed.
Which is kind of unfair. So, and I've got a particular interest in that, because I'm a cancer victim, like millions of others. So that's very important as well. Very, very important to level this up a little bit.
Well, it reminds me of the technological leap that a lot of developing countries made, where millions of people have never had a landline. They've gone from no communications to mobile phones, and in some ways, what you guys could do is help them make that leap from having no infrastructure to having the very latest in aviation connectivity.
Why shouldn't they have it?
Yeah, exactly.
And what's also interesting, Nick, and one of the benefits of using the airship in that way that I hadn't considered until I spoke to a group who looks after the interests of indigenous people in the Amazon region, is actually they don't want the road driven through the rainforest. They that's their home. They don't want that destroyed, and they don't actually want the unfettered access, which brings with it all the developed country problems of diseases that they haven't had to face, of crime, of drugs, etc., etc. So having the airship, which connects them, but connects them in a manageable way, is seen as particularly attractive.
Yes.
But it isn't just people in very remote areas. I mean, there's a big need, as Mark's been developing this in Alaska, Mark.
Yeah, Alaska and Canada, places that you think are well served. And I sat on an aircraft next to a lady who'd flown into Kuujjuaq from her village in the north of Canada, and she'd flown 2 hours in a light aircraft to get to Kuujjuaq. And Kuujjuaq is about halfway up Canada. Right? So that's then a 2-hour flight in a 737 south to Montreal, to give you an idea. And she was making that flight with her friends. So I sat next to her as she flew down to Montreal just to have a scan, because she had some complications with her pregnancy. So she was then going to stay in Montreal whilst she was scanned, and then the tests were evaluated, and then the treatment and whatever needed was then put in place. But that's a country like Canada, and you think of all the other countries around the world and all the other continents which are more remote. But Alaska, Canada, places where the environment and concern for environmental damage is obviously very important.
And the ice roads.
And the ice roads and the unreliability and seasonality of the solutions that they have in place, barging, ice roads. The airship gets over all of those. So rather than accessing for maybe a month, a year, the airship would give access 11 months out of the year. And these are all important factors. The cost of transportation when you go to somewhere in the north of Alaska or in the north of Canada is huge, and a huge part of the cost of buying products on shelves if they're available. If you go up to the north of Canada, if you go to north of Yellowknife, you might be paying $30 for a cabbage, $35, $35 for a litre of orange juice, and that's all in the transport costs. And the airship, I'm not suggesting we're just going to take orange juice up and down, but it's an example of the problem that exists and the living conditions, the difficulty in living. If you have a mine in a remote part of the world, and you have a problem, you may not be able to access that for 10 months. So what do? You close the whole facility down. You get all your people out. You hire a C-130 Hercules aircraft to fly in and in a rescue situation. Well, the airship can carry on flying, and that can be sorted out
You can
within a
continue
matter
your
of days,
operation.
and you can continue your operation.
Yeah, interesting. This is probably a question for Director of Operations, Jim.
Sure.
We're talking about operating airships over hostile environments, over the wilds of Alaska, the Amazon. What kind of challenges in terms of human factors for the crew, for the pilots, for the people supporting the operation back in the control center? What kind of challenges is this kind of mission going to present?
Actually, quite a few. But you need to approach it responsibly and look at all of the areas of risk and develop ways to mitigate those risks, which is quite possible. I mean, it's easy to do. Once you understand the problem, you find a solution for it. The hybrid airship, because it doesn't have a mooring mast, it represents an entirely new concept of operation for an aircraft. We'll be operating more like an ocean-going ship. We'll have the staff to man it 24/7. So we'll be flying it when the weather is conducive. There is no scheduled maintenance. We'll be flying it. So we understand what it's going to take to operate it and the number of people that will be exposed. And we'll come up with a procedure to carry out the operation with respect to the environment and the elevation and climate. So the entire concept of operating is something that is obviously going to be taken very seriously and scrutinized. And at the end of the day, we have to convince the regulatory authorities that we're going to be able to operate safely and in conformance with the regulations, which we can do. I mean,
absolutely. If I can make 2 points, one specific, as we're talking about Brazil, we have operated airships in Brazil. I mean, Brazil is familiar with airships, and that is good, and it makes our job easier. But in our previous guys, when we had the fleet of advertising airships, we operated in, I think, 35 odd countries in the world. And part of our particular skill base is exactly what Jim's just described there, both working with the governments and the aviation authorities in establishing operations that meet with their requirements. And I think, in a more general sense, this is one of the most important things. Why are we here as Straightline as an operator? Well, we're here because we have that operation experience and background. And slightly oddly, it's something which is often missed out. People, look at the technology side of it. Oh, this is great. It's a new aircraft, and then they get excited about that, and a lot of money pours into various projects. But the bit that's missed out very often is well, how's it going to operate?
Exactly.
And who's going to operate it? And in what way is it going to be operated? And these are all key questions. It's you wouldn't think about getting if it was a new fixed-wing aircraft when they were first coming onto the market, you wouldn't just jump in and off you go. I mean, some people did, and they came to a sticky end.
That's good.
But,
that's precisely where we come in.
Yeah,
you can get a manufacturer build the best aircraft in the world. You need someone to operate it and understand it.
Well, that's
my
interest. I mean, my day job, as listeners will know, is railway operations. It's the nuts and bolts of your train. How do you use this train to move people from A to B, and what's involved in that? But lots of this discussion. I mean, it's fascinating because you are not just trying to bring a new aircraft to market. You are in some ways at the leading edge of a whole new industry, and that there'll be challenges, commercial, technical, legal, operational. I guess a lot of this must fall on you, Mark, as CEO. How are you dealing with these things? Stuff must come up all the time.
Yeah, I think it is a team effort, and we're a close team and work together for many decades now. And we've done it before, I mean, and we've done exactly that before with airships all over the world. So it's not something that is new to us in that sense.
Now, when we started in the airship business, there were 3 airships in the world. And in 5 years' time, 5 years' time, we were operating 19. And that's just 5 years, and it was a new aircraft. So we took, and with ballooning, for the reasons I've explained, we took a very small industry and a non-existent industry and turned it into we became the largest aerial advertising company on the planet. And so we have done it before. We'll make mistakes like everyone else, but we know we do. It's true. I have a bit of a lead on most people because of our previous experience.
Yes, and I guess that's what gives you the credibility to be able to go to a manufacturer and say, "We'll be a good ambassador for your product," because
exactly that, and we've been approached by a number of the OEMs out there, and we've looked at what they have to offer, and as Mike said earlier, we'd love there to be other people other than AT2 as it now is, who are looking to develop and finish the development of the Lockheed airship technology. We welcome the opportunity to work with airship manufacturers wherever they may be in the world as operator, and to sit between the OEM and the end use customer, which is really where we are.
Absolutely. So another factor of this sort of new industry phenomenon, if you like, is the public perception of airships. And we were discussing this before we started recording, but after I did my TEDx talk, one of the things I realized from the reaction of this room of 700 intelligent, educated people was how little people understood about lighter than air, about airships generally. It seems that lots of people don't have a frame of reference for the product. And this must also potentially sometimes include possible clients. So have you encountered this? How would you approach this problem?
That's a very good question, and I think that the short answer to that is yes. And we do see that it as an issue on a fairly regular basis. Unfortunately, people either don't have an understanding in some cases, or more often they remember the Zeppelins of the 1930s and so on, even though that's nearly 100 years ago. So we have to go through it piece by piece. We have to explain what the differences are. First and foremost, the air envelope is filled with helium. Helium is an inert gas, therefore inherently safe. It puts out fires. It's not flammable like hydrogen. And sometimes you have to really go back to that, to that stage and bring people through the process of understanding both what an airship is and or why it is different from airships historically. Jim was invited out to an air safety conference, which we both spoke at in Paris just about a year ago, wasn't it now, Jim? Mm-hmm. To do exactly that and to explain to the industry, and there's a lot of people from logistics and mining and so on, what the airship was, why it was different, why it was safer, why it was operationally capable, how we would operate, and how we would ensure that we operated safely. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, now we've been invited to re-engage.
Opened a lot of eyes, didn't it?
Yeah, in terms of setting the standards, because that's important for us in any new industry. It's setting the standards for the industry, the whole industry to follow, because what we don't want, whoever it is that's flying the airship, is for there to be an incident or an accident which colours people's perception. And we were very, very successful in the old Virgin airship and balloon days of doing exactly that, because of Mike's beliefs and attitude to risk and knowledge at that point, coupled with Jim and his extensive knowledge of operating airships and the team that was recruited, who had that ethos baked into them. That meant, and to give you an example, I think when I joined, our insurance premium was something like 10% of the whole value, and by the time we finished, it was close to 1%. Yeah. And that was because we changed the way airships were perceived, because we went about and operated, and we instilled a professional discipline
right.
that you would find in any aircraft, operator that's operating fixed wing or rotary wing aircraft. Historically, airships and so on have seen a bit airy fairy.
Yes, just because this might have this particular form of aircraft might have eccentric routes. We mentioned Alberto Santos Dumont doesn't mean it's any less professional than any other branch of aviation.
Correct.
And I wonder whether actually the fact that you are at the leading edge, that you are having to take people in potential clients in presentations back to first principles is actually an opportunity, because then you can take them back and then walk them through why this is a good idea, and they don't have those preconceptions.
I think there is that's certainly also true, and it's rarely that I think we go into meetings wherever we start from that we don't leave with the customer or the people we're engaging understanding why, particularly this design of an airship.
I think there's two levels. There's the general public, but then you also have to look at the governing authorities like the FAA and how they perceive it, what their understanding of it is. When I got my license in the Goodyear blimp, the FESDO inspector who came out to observe and test me, it was the first time I'd ever been in an airship. And the chief pilot was actually in the right seat telling me what to do, and he was just observing. So the level of expertise the aviation authority had was very limited. Now, over the course of time, and especially with our introduction to the industry with the Lightship Group, and our activity with the FAA, is we had a contract to train FAA inspectors, and we helped them write the practical test as a practical test standard for airship pilots, and they gained more knowledge and experience. When back then, when you got your license, and still today, you were qualified as an instructor. You could fly IFR without the ratings. That's why we require a pilot to have those ratings coming through the door. Because we go up in that environment. No, you didn't need it. FAA didn't think it was necessary. They didn't understand it completely. But it is an aircraft that maintains positive reference. So you can be flying into a cloud. You're not going to end up upside down coming out of it. So you don't really need an instrument rating, but you do. The FAA are becoming more aware and savvy to what's needed, and we're working with them in that regard. The general public, like you said, people really don't understand what airships are and how they operate. And I think when we get our first customer and we have a few lined up and we go out and we're successful and we're operating, we're delivering cargo, it's going to blow everybody away. They're going to go, wow. Yeah, this is something good,
and it's going to help the planet.
Yes, absolutely,
enormously.
Yes,
I'm 78 years old, so it's not all about making money with me anymore.
Yeah,
it's about a different type of aviation, giving back in a different type of way.
Absolutely, and I think when you mention your age, Mike, I'm thinking I'm just about the youngster of the three of us here. But part of the reason, maybe when you talk to people about airships, they're not quite so aware is, I started in the industry in 1993 when I was 30, and we haven't seen airships flying in this country for some time now, not on a regular basis anyway. So there's now actually quite a gap between the heyday of airships, the advertising airship, and where we are now today, 30 years on.
And I think actually what Jim says is true. What you need is for them to start flying and for them to become a more regular feature in the sky. And I guess on that basis, and to wrap up this discussion, what's the next steps for Straightline? What's on the horizon?
Well, a lot more of what we've already been doing, engaging with customers, with governments, with NGOs. We have a good relationship with the UN. We have a lot of good opportunities to pursue. We're now waiting for our friends at AT2 to get the airship developed, finish the development, get it certified. They've already demonstrated at the time with Lockheed the principles with the P791. They've had various things approved by the FAA, including the design. So they're a long way down the line. A lot of money's been spent already in getting the Airship to where it is now. But it still needs to be certified, and then we can take it out on the road. In the meantime, we're looking at recreating some of the adventurous exploits that Mike talked about with flying around the world, and our aim will be to take this airship around the world in the run up to its final certification.
Oh, what an adventure that will be! Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for giving us the benefit of your expertise and experience. It's been a very interesting discussion, so thank you very much indeed for the warm welcome here at Straightline Aviation.
It's a pleasure.
It's nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.